Welcome back to MythVision Podcast. I'm your host, Derek Lambert. Ladies and gentlemen, I've been diving into this question for, 5 years now. Who is Jesus? Did he even exist? If he didn't exist, then what the heck are we doing? What is the New Testament? All of these things I've been diving into, trying to understand. And, I went from full-blown Jesus is God in the flesh to full-blown Jesus is a mythical character who was crafted into stories that never happened and never existed at all. And then I started to lean back into, well, hold on. They did mythologize historical people and thought that made a lot of sense. But one thing about me is I know I could never prove the guy existed unless we found his, bones and were able to somehow triangulate that and know it was him. There's no way to prove he didn't exist ultimately with absolute certainty. But I'm still sympathetic and always have been to how far we should have confidence in a guy named Jesus existing. And a couple years ago, I had a guy commenting saying, oh, you think that's something that should be questioned? Well, we should be questioning Paul's existence. And I thought, this guy is nuts. How dare you even think that? Like, can't you see Paul's a frustrated Jew who's got like the temperament of a 10-year-old and angry all the time and is showing his clearly non-fictional aspects in these epistles? And then there have been a few scholars along the way who said, actually, these are epistolary fictions. And if there's one thing I've learned over 5 years is how often what we think is a criterion of embarrassment actually turns out to be like a common central element. Like, oh, Jesus wouldn't have embarrassingly been crucified on a cross. So then Addis having his junk cut off as the central figure and the central theme of his myth isn't embarrassing at all, right? It's actually part of the myth. Okay, where do we go with this? So I have two gentlemen joining me today, and they have their own observations that they've been diving into this stuff for quite some time, trying to understand, did Jesus exist? Did Paul exist? And really, what's going on with the New Testament? So for the first time, welcome to MythVision. Sorry for the long intro. Would you two gentlemen introduce yourself to our audience? I wanted to lay a little bit of a groundwork. So thanks for joining me.
Yeah. So my name's Matthew Brit. I'm one of the co-authors of the book Christ Before Jesus, and it takes a look at the New Testament from a stylometric point of view. And we're going to be looking at some of the software we use to analyze the text of the New Testament.
Yes. My name is Jaaron Wingo, and I am the other co-author to Christ Before Jesus. And it has been an absolute wild ride taking a look at all this and just the amount of things that we just keep finding, even after our book came out. And we just keep digging. We enjoy this kind of stuff. It is something that has been, saturated into the society that we live in. We live in the Bible Belt here in America. So it's all around us. So it's something that has interested us for quite some time, is taking a look at the Bible, more specifically the New Testament.
So your book, Christ Before Jesus, and you're passionate about this and weird like me, which is not really weird because everyone, we probably raised fundamentalists in some way, and growing up with Jesus is kind of the pop culture idea of religion that we were taught in America. But why did you write the book? What is the book about? People can go in the description, get a copy of it. The link will be there. But also, why are you guys doing this?
Yeah, well, like you had guessed, we do have a background in the church. We grew up in a Southern Baptist church together. We met when we were 11, so that's quite a time ago.
11,
Yeah. And so we left the church a long time ago, and it kind of just became something in the background. We never really thought about it for, 10 years or more. And something came up in conversation between me and Jaaron, and we were like, hey, let's look into it again. And we were just looking into it, and I was like, I wish there was something more objective that you can use to look at this text rather than just, this person's opinion on what this means and this person's opinion on, what Paul meant when he said this. So we looked around and we found that there's actually open source software that you can use that stylometrically analyzes the text of the New Testament. And you can do it on the chapter level now, just about how much technology has advanced over the years. And so, the book basically follows our journey through mythicism and just really the historicity of Jesus overall. We start with an intro for people who might not be familiar with, like, why even ask the question, did Jesus exist? What about, Josephus and Tacitus and so on? And so we cover that. And then the second half of the book goes into the stylometric analysis that we do.
Well, and why name it, just briefly, if you don't, I want to get deeper into this, but why name it Christ before Jesus? Some people might go, what do you think? Jesus was around in 200 BC. Like, what is your reason for naming it that?
Well, we dive in a couple times in our book to something called, or what we call, the synonym problem. The idea that just because Christ is mentioned doesn't necessarily mean that Jesus is being mentioned. That Christ is simply just a word that just means anointed one. It comes from Greek. Christus in specific would be the Latin version of it. But that being said, the Christians, what we find over our research is that Christians existed prior to the Gospels being written, meaning that they worshipped a Christ figure before Jesus enters the scene.
So in a sense, this echoes a little bit of what Carrier is suggesting of they already had a messianism style type angelic, or even maybe not even taking that approach, right? Which we've talked about off air. There are other ways to analyze mythicism other than necessarily doing the angelic model, but that they had believed in this divine figure that they called the Christ. And you're saying Jews were already believing in such a thing before the character Jesus comes on the scene. And so technically here you have, like, they're pointing to this guy, and then they're crafting a euhemerist approach of, like, here's this guy in history narratives.
More or less. Right. So we find that when we look at the text, we find more evidence to support the Marcionite origins of Christianity. And Marcion was one of the first heretics, and he published his gospel and Paul's letters, his version of Paul's letters, in the 140s. And so what we think is what probably happened is Christianity probably started as some kind of mystery cult,
void of any connection to Judaism.
Yeah, at most it would have been something like the Hypsisterians, which were like a Jewish mystery cult. And they had their own version of Zeus Hypsistos, which is Zeus the Most High, which is the name they use for Yahweh in Judaism sometimes. And so that evolved into Marcionite theology, or at least that early form of Marcionite theology. And then with his publication of what was probably the first New Testament, and we're not the only ones to say that, that spurs on the gospel boom, and it spurs on this reaction to Marcion's theology. And then that's how we get the New Testament, is largely in response to Marcion publishing his version of these texts.
And of course, 144, roughly 144, when Marcion publishes this New Testament, would be post Bar Kokhba revolt, which is when Emperor Hadrian laid waste to Judea, renamed it to Roman Palestina, which is where we get Palestine today. And the Jews in specific needed to flee the area and would just go into the surrounding areas, which would mix in with this mystery cult, and the rest is more or less history. That's when you start to see this Judeo-Christianity kind of form, and we get the Gospels as we know them.
So there's a little overlap that I've recently been doing with Gad Barnea, who writes on Yahwism all the way back to the Persian period and moving forward. And he argues that Yahwism was far more popular than people give credit for. What is Yahwism? It's not Judaism. Judaism, specifically Hasmonean, if you will, the Maccabees and such, start to formulate a national identity and religious kind of movement with this literature we call the Torah, whereas Yahwism is still the worship of Yahweh, but it was more open and broad to syncretic things like Yahweh Dionysus or Yahweh Zeus, Yahweh Jupiter. They were able to say they're worshiping this god named Yahweh or Yahweh or Yah, and yet they weren't necessarily kosher or following a guy named Moses. Kind of like we see mixed blends of like Enochian versus Mosaic Judaism. Different groups, clearly different theologies, and they aren't in agreement. They have different approaches on how they go to believing. Yahwism was more general and even more popular, according to him. And he says this explains Gnosticism. So why anyone would even attach themselves to this deity, and yet it doesn't demand the typical model. If we're reevaluating Christianity using your guys' kind of idea of reevaluating it, it doesn't demand this idea that here are these like Torah observant Jews. Earliest Christians are like Torah observant, almost like in a lineage of Maccabees, and they're all like totally observant. And then all of a sudden it starts to grow out of there. And as you start to get Gentiles in, the movement starts to change and stuff. It isn't necessarily demanding that he's suggesting. He's saying you already had Gentiles, like you said. Hypsosterians is a form of Jews that we hear from Philo of Alexandria. And of course, Josephus mentions them as well. But like, he's saying that Gentiles are already worshiping this God. They're already attending synagogue, if you will, to come and hear readings from some of the literature that's related to Yahweh, to Yahweh, however you want to pronounce the name. So this is a really interesting perspective that I really like considering. Not the standard view that we've always been told, but like, what if Gnostics came first? And I don't mean Gnostics in like, we know that category's a debated, like, what does this really mean? But like, what if Paul is closer to that kind of thinking in his letters than the orthodox, which ends up winning out eventually, view? You know what I mean?
Right. Yeah. That's where we had to go with it, because, we came from, even after having like left the church, into the mainstream position. Like Paul has probably 7 authentic letters. He wrote at this time. Gospel Mark was around 70 or so. And we had to reevaluate really everything, because once we ran our tests, we were like, well, this just does not match what, that never saw a 7 authentic letter corpus anywhere in Paul. So we had to reevaluate a lot of stuff. And that's a lot of what took our time writing the book, is just having to relearn what
just about everything.
Yeah. Where this could have come from. So
as me, I imagine you guys started gravitating to certain thinkers and really bright PhDs that help you consider and think outside that typical box. That's what I'm thankful about with experts that are in the field who don't necessarily agree with the rest of the stream of salmon that are swimming the same direction. So if you would, can you tease us by showing or presenting a brief truncated version of what you guys are postulating so that my audience can consider what you're bringing to the table and evaluate it? I asked the audience to evaluate it, consider what's being said, be critical. If you find any flaws or any questions or any things you consider, I'm not so sure, but at the same time, what if these guys are onto something? So yeah, sounds like a plan. You guys want to present something here?
Yeah. So what we'll do is we'll go over this little presentation, and then we'll actually demo the software. So again, the software is called Stylo. It's free and open source, and we encourage people in our book to go and do this yourselves, because all you've got to do is just the legwork of collecting those texts and installing the software.
And it is a package that runs in our studio. Right. It is peer-reviewed. It's definitely solid software. We didn't just, make it up.
Yeah, we don't have a black box of software that we do this with. We try to make everything transparent.
Yeah. Got it.
So here's more or less our thesis. Like we were talking about, we think these texts come around in the 2nd century.
And this is the entire New Testament.
Right. Yeah. This is
not just the Gospels. This is Paul's letters and everything that you would find within the New Testament.
Right. And we get into, the historicity of Jesus in the book, but really a lot of it's built on, this is in the 2nd century. We go into the fact that there's just a lack of historical, like archaeological evidence for Jesus, but that's well established in other fields and scholars.
Right. Jesus not existing, questioning Paul, obviously, these are just byproducts of our understanding of the dating of the New Testament, this redating, if you will.
Right.
And by the way, just before you guys continue with the whole idea of him not existing, I'm approaching this with already these assumptions I have, other biases, if you will. We all have them.
Right.
Of assuming there was likely a guy mythologized. Would your model still work? I want to ask that up front before we continue. Could your model still work with suggesting, well, maybe there was a dude, decades ago, but they completely mythologized him, and we really are at the same conclusion, I think so. Because here's the deal. The historical guy, never really mattered, because if he did, you wouldn't have done all this. So I think, I'm not going to say he wasn't significant. If there was a dude, he might have been charismatic, like any cult leader. But eventually, when you write the story about the 10-foot Goliath monster fighter, hero named Heracles, if there was a dude, it's irrelevant. Alexander the Great's birth narrative. I'm sorry, I'm stopping just for this moment to make this point, but like Richard C. Miller says this in his book, classicists to this day are scratching at the biography narratives of Alexander the Great. Okay, he tamed a horse as a 12-year-old like Jesus in the temple. Oh, there's magi signifying his coming. Oh my gosh, he's birthed by a divine figure and God comes down and impregnates his mom. But this might have happened or this. And he's like, you're missing the point, guys. Like if there is anything there that actually is history, you're just not going to have any certainty unless you can anchor it outside of it. Like you're reading this material wrong if you think they're writing you a history. That's the point. I think at the end of the day, we're dealing with a Christ. We're dealing with a divine figure in a cult, not, hey guys, this is what Jesus did on Wednesday. No. So sorry to interrupt.
No, and I think the way we present it in the book is that the natural Jesus, the historical Jesus as presented in the New Testament did not exist. So as present, like if there was a guy or if it's an amalgamation of guys, that's totally possible. And we don't ever say that that's not the case. We're not like, oh, we can't be convinced otherwise. We're just saying that, right now we put the Gospel of Mark, a lot of people do, at 70. And that's already, 30, 40 years after that's happening. We're putting it another 100 years later. So at that point, you mean
170 or you guys are...
Yeah, well, 100 years after Jesus. So it's 130s, 140s. Yeah.
Got it. Okay, sorry.
No, that's fine. Well,
I'll try not to interrupt unless I think it's relevant to help people.
Yeah. We do think there are some that were written in 170, but not the Gospels. The Gospels were probably finished by then.
Like epistles and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Okay.
As Matthew was saying, it's our official position is that even the natural Jesus, as presented by the New Testament, didn't exist. Okay. And of course, like I said, that would be a byproduct of what we find. But if you want to craft a narrative that says that a man named Jesus was going around in the first century, number one, obviously that which is presented without evidence can be dismissed without evidence. But at the same time, he would have to be a Jesus more or less in name only. That would have to be the only real connection between this Jesus that is crafted and the Jesus of the New Testament, because the natural Jesus of the New Testament just doesn't fit into history on a timeline, especially when we get into who in specific is behind the first gospel published and the evolution of this character as it keeps going.
Okay. So that's something to consider, viewers, is Marcion priority and how, if you understand Marcion, and they're going to explain why they start with that and all that. I'm sure we're going to get into that, but I just want the audience to understand, if you see that Marcion's gospel as first, okay, you could see what's going on using that approach.
Right. Yeah. And because again, Marcion's gospel, he has Jesus descend from heaven directly. Yeah. In his gospel.
As a fully grown man.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's a
keep that in mind.
Yeah. So y'all are probably all familiar with the issues of reliability in regards to the dating of the New Testament itself. They've moved P52 up to around 200. The John Ryland's library that holds it does. The first, as far as we're aware, non-Christian reference to Christian scripture is Lucian of Samosata, who says there was a charlatan in his time writing Christian texts and editing Christian texts.
Peregrinus.
Yes. Yep. So we can get into that. We've got theories on that too.
I love that whole dude. Lucian, I feel bad for anyone who ever has to be written about by a guy like that after you're dead. You are so screwed if a Lucian writes about you.
You do not want to cross his path.
Thank you.
He's great. And then even internal like Christian references, there's going to be, First Clement, Ignatius, and again we can get into the debate on those dates and stuff like that. There are some anachronisms in it, and things like that. So we really build the case around Marcion's gospel, which was published again in or around 144. Luke, just to fill everybody in, Marcion's gospel was basically a trimmed down version of Luke. The argument that we have from early Christians was whether or not Marcion's gospel was the original version or if he cut stuff out. And so Tertullian, writing around the year 200 or so, says that Marcion cut the first 3 chapters out of Luke and a lot of the end, and then pieces here and there. But the Marcionites claimed, no, our version of Luke that starts somewhere in chapter 4, or our chapter 4, they would have called it chapter 1, or not chapters at all.
Yeah.
I know what you mean. That would have been their starting
right.
point.
Yeah. So it would have been the original for the Marcionites. They claimed that Marcion was the first to publish it. And so then we went to the actual text before we run the stylometric analysis. So in Luke's prologue, we already see the author or the editor saying, hey, this was handed down not from, other people. I did not write this. This is from other people. I'm taking this.
Yeah.
And he's saying that they were eyewitnesses.
Yeah, he has sources. He has other sources. Yeah.
Right. And so he also addresses it to Theophilus, which a lot of Christians, you probably remember from church, they'll say, well, Theophilus means God lover. And so it's meant for you. He wrote this for you, or God wrote this for you in mind.
Oh, yeah.
yeah. Because you love God, etc. But Theophilus was actually the name of a bishop shortly after Marcion was running around and promoting his gospel. And it's Theophilus of Antioch. And
okay. You guys are doing, this is interesting. Just already. I'm sorry I have to jab in here, but this is cool to think about. What if Theophilus was this guy that he's actually writing to? I have heard that, maybe he's writing to a guy named Theophilus, which was a patron. He was a Gentile. I know that's John Dominic Crossan's views. Here's this God lover, kind of like God-fearers who are non-Jews. And then there's almost the idea that it's a group of God lovers that he's writing for, not necessarily like we do today, where it's he's writing to me. But in that context, in the first century, or whenever they say he wrote it in the early second. So this is something to consider. I never really thought about the bishop part. Anyway, please continue.
Well, later on, when the Gospel of Luke is used again, I believe the Diatessaron, the earlier part, this introduction of Theophilus is actually taken out.
Right.
Because they understood that was an introduction. That's something that's literally addressing somebody who it's not really part of the gospel at all.
Right.
So they removed the beginning of it.
Right. I think we're historically lucky to have this in there because, like Jaaron's saying, there were versions even of the canonical Luke minus this part floating around more or less. But the fact that we got this version that addresses it to somebody that
almost by accident.
Yeah. And we know Theophilus was able to read and write because he wrote his own text, and we have some that still survive. So it makes sense that this, the literacy rate being really low back then, I think it helps. But then we look at where we really build the case. This is in, if you want to open your Bibles to Luke 4.
Yes.
Everybody turn.
Luke 4:23 is what we consider to be the kicker, if you will. In this particular verse, just kind of leading up to it, Jesus is preaching in a synagogue. He's reading from the scriptures in a synagogue in Nazareth. And people are wowed by what he's saying and how smart he is and everything like that. In Luke 4:23, he says, I bet what you'll want me to do is miracles like I did back in Capernaum. So as you can see there on the screen, do here in your hometown what we have heard that you did in Capernaum. But the problem is he hasn't been to Capernaum yet.
In Luke. Yeah.
He hasn't shown up in Capernaum until Luke 4:31. This is problematic because not only has he not been to Capernaum, he also hasn't done any miracles yet. So unless someone says, we think that it's actually, you got to read this book and you got to read this book to figure out. Well, unfortunately, like I said, in verse 31, that's when Luke actually has him going to Capernaum first. Now, that verse is only found in two Gospels. That is found in the Gospel of Luke, and it's found in all reconstructions, and especially according to Tertullian, it was also found in Marcion's Evangelion. In Evangelion, Jesus comes down out of heaven, fully grown, and descends into Capernaum from the very get-go. And he does miracles. Then in Nazareth, he teaches in a synagogue, and then people say these particular lines. This line shows up. It's in place in Marcion's Evangelion, but in the Gospel of Luke, it's literally out of place.
Right.
It doesn't fit.
So I know it's in Mark. I know Mark mentions right at the end. I was just double checking to make sure that he goes to a synagogue on the Sabbath in Mark 1:21, performs an exorcism, driving out an unclean spirit. But either way you put it, because I know a lot of scholars who say Luke's using Mark, as like a background source that he's working with. Either way, though, why is it you're saying do like you did over here, but then right after? So chronologically speaking, the version of Luke we have right now, just it's odd that right after you say that, he then has to go and do the thing. It doesn't make sense. So even if you say he's grabbing from Mark when he does go, but you're suggesting you think this is more, as scholars point out, Luke and Marcion tension, rather than necessarily he's lifting from Mark. Maybe he is, but it's irrelevant because the chronology in Luke's version we have now doesn't make sense.
Correct. Not only that, but as we get into in just a bit, Luke chapter 4, halfway through it is what actually in the stylometric analysis results bounces around a bit. It bounces between the author of Luke chapter 3 and the rest of, or the bulk of Luke, Luke 4 through roughly 4 through 22 or so.
Okay, just so our audience knows what stylometric and all that is, you're going to have to give a little bit more of that as we go. I know.
We will definitely be getting into that.
To dumb down what you just said is the author of chapter 3, which is not Marcion's, is interrupting, to use the best term. His words are interrupting here in 4, where authentic Marcion version is.
Yes.
Okay,
about halfway through chapter 4 is where it, for lack of a better term, flips. And they start using this other source for a really long time, for the bulk of Luke. With slight edits in there, but for the bulk of Luke, it flips there, and it starts to flip halfway through 4. So we're able to see that line in specific is definitely something that is being lifted from Marcion, as opposed to just something that was taken from some other text that we don't have anymore, or possibly something that would have been more from a person who was just reading Mark, as opposed to taking it from.
Right. And you have to keep in mind, they weren't reading, for at least the earlier years, a 4 canon gospel where you would read Mark first. Like, even if the author here used Mark when writing this, that doesn't mean that everyone else reading it is going to first read Mark and then read this one, because clearly this one alone is addressing it to Theophilus. He's sending it to someone. He's not sending, as far as we know, a copy of Mark to someone as well, and say, hey, read this first, so you get when I get to chapter 4.
I mean, he's literally trying to say this is the orderly version. This is the orderly version. This is the best version.
And again,
I only mention that because I know Papias, and that's another problem, right? We get Papias in Eusebius, but I know Papias is mentioning Mark. He mentions 2 Matthews. He doesn't mention Luke or John.
Right. So
by his period, there is no as far as if you take that to the bank. But I imagine you guys have something that you
So
explain all that.
Yeah. So for the authors that you find in Eusebius, he'll quote a lot of people, and also we find a line from Papias in Irenaeus, who is a little bit before Eusebius, writing in the 180s, and they say, there's Mark, and he got it from Peter, and he just wrote down what Peter said. And then there's Matthew, and Matthew wrote in Hebrew, which that's not true. I mean, well, at least the Gospel of Matthew we have today shows
no indication of that. Yeah.
So we do have Revelation looks like it was a translation. I think James Tabor also has a reconstruction of Revelation as a translation from Hebrew into Greek. So Revelation, except the first 3 chapters, which are those letters to different churches, that is a translation from Hebrew. And it acts like it. So when we run it, it actually comes up closer to this Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Old Testament. But all the other New Testament books are way up here, because these are all originally Greek, including Matthew. And we ran chapter by chapter, and none of Matthew really looks like it was a translation.
Right.
I think in some people didn't. Some scholars suggest that when he said that, I don't know, they're trying to rationalize Papias, but at best, I think it's because sometimes he'll use an Aramaic phrase or an Aramaic word or a Hebrew word, and that's at best.
Yeah, and then when they do that, it's clear that it's a fictional trope to add in foreign language in your text to make it sound. It's like when in Harry Potter they use the Latin spells. I mean,
or in Mos Eisley in Star Wars, you have Huddies or something like that.
Right.
That's being
got it.
But you have to have subtitles to know what it means.
Why you think about in Jesus' crucifixion, when he cries out, I don't know if it's in Mark or Matthew, he cries out, you know, the
Eloi,
verse.
Eloi, lama sabachthani. Yeah.
Right. So when he says that, they don't understand him, and like he's speaking the native language of the area at the time. Why don't they understand? And it's because the author's probably thinking of these people as being like the readers who are fully Greek and don't know Aramaic.
Yeah. So it's foreign to the authors, it's foreign to the readers. Yeah.
So he slipped up there probably because he's inserting this Aramaic as like a trope of like, look, it's foreign, this is authentic. But
let me immerse you into
but then
story.
But then why would the people, because it says different gospels say, you know, like the women were there who would have spoken Aramaic, all these people who would have spoken Aramaic were there, and they don't understand Jesus when he says it.
Yeah.
Because why, you know? And that it just, there are tropes like this where it slips up. These Aramaicisms are part of the fictional. It's just like
I think it's cool. I mean, it's just me reading it. It just adds like a dimension. I think
exactly.
you know, like it just adds a cool dimension. Like here's this guy echoing the Davidic king himself in Psalm 22. He's echoing that kind of same kind of flavor. There's no reason to think if there was a dude who did get crucified that like the last moment on the Canon camera, he's like, Eli, you know what I mean? Like,
exactly.
Come on.
This would be really good for the Bible. Make sure you write this
down. Write this down, Mark. Not you, Luke. Not you, Matthew. I'm just kidding. Anyway.
John, you write it down. Also, there's your mom.
Yeah. Your mom's very close. Remember that. All right.
So we'll keep going. You kind of heard the claim there about Luke, and we'll get into Paul too in a minute. So let's go over what stylometry is before we actually jump into these tests. So stylometry is the application of the study of style. Normally, we're running computerized stylometry. If you've ever heard Bart Ehrman say things like, well, the pastorals, 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, and Titus can't be by Paul because he uses this vocabulary or he uses this in this frequency or this grammar, you know, that's a form of stylometry. So what we do, though, is we look at the most frequent words on levels that are basically, I wouldn't say impossible for humans to do, but just so large scale, done by a computer, because it's just faster. It's not AI. It's not even a machine learning model we use.
It's also more reliable because humans, again, you know. But I like what you're saying. Yeah.
Some people have thought that, you know, it's AI or machine learning to some degree, but they've assumed that we are running what's called a supervised model. What that means is that they think stylometry is used in a way where we say, this is the author. This is our known author. Go look for things like this.
Right. So you provide
That's not what we do at all.
Right. So in what's called a supervised model, and normally it's a machine learning terminology, but we'll use it here. Okay. Supervised model would be, we provide, let's say, Romans or 1 Corinthians as core Paul, and that's real Paul.
You're assuming already that's the guy.
You go in with
Right. Yep. And so we don't do that. We do what's called an unsupervised model. So what we do is we tell the software, just look at the frequencies and ratios on this and visualize it for us. Like provide, and it's called a dendrogram. It's that tree graph, like a family tree graph.
We'll see
pull
that
one
in
up.
a bit.
Yeah. But we say just, you know, lump things together when they look like they're by the same author or they have the same, you know, frequencies here. Yeah. Don't assume anything.
Just give us the results.
And that's called unsupervised because there's no input from us other than just look at these texts.
Yeah. And so we feel like that's the most scientific way to approach it.
I like that. And there's no like already traditional approach that you have to start with. I also like this. I like this because you can do this with just the 7. You could do this with the 14, including Hebrews. You could do this with the 4 Gospels. You could do this with additional literature outside of our canon. You could do this with church fathers. You could do this with anything. And
we did this. We chopped the New Testament into chapters and we ran it against itself. And then we ran it against anything we could get our hands on in Greek from the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd century CE and the 1st century BCE as well. At one point in time, the largest run we did was just shy of about 1,000 different files.
Oh no, we've got bigger now. So as of like 2 weeks ago, I added in other stuff from like other periods, but in Greek we ran 2,200 files of various sizes, and it was like 10 million plus.
Let me ask you before you continue in here. I got to ask you guys because you've been running this for a while and you know what you're doing with this machine. Have you ever ran, because this would make me feel a little more confident in it, right? I mean, just me as a human, it makes me feel comfortable, okay? I need a little comfort here, man. You know, back in the day, Dr. Dr. Price, I'd interview him, and he's like, well, I'll tell you, the academics, they need that comfort. So once you pull Paul's rug up from underneath them, they're screwed. And he's not wrong, okay?
That's
so,
true,
like, if Paul is pulled out from underneath us, what the hell do we think we know when it comes to all this? So this is my ask. I ask for some comforting and insight is this. Tell me there is someone in the 1st, 2nd, 3rd BC into the CE area that you've ran that has come back based on the stylometric computer that has said, now this is authentic. I mean, like there might have been a few words that have been added as a scribally, but like this literally is 95% this dude, and we can tell based on the machine or something like that.
Josephus is probably one of our most reliable out of like any run that we have. Every work that we have of his, which we ran all of his works, we broke it down by books because each, like you read Antiquities and it's like a bunch of different books inside that book.
Right.
Yeah. So we broke it down by book. We've even broken it down by smaller sections. The only thing that looks weird, and it's not even far away from Josephus, is I think it's Antiquities 17, 18, and 19 seem to have some influence from another thing. He may have just been using a source. We know that there was another historian called Justus around his time that he had like a beef with. So it may have been, maybe he took from that, but it's enough of his style overall in that each of those books that Josephus is solid. I would say.
Well, there's also some books of the Bible or books of the New Testament that come back as one author or author group. It's not who they're normally tradition says, but it's still together. Like for instance, and you'll see here in a bit, the book of Acts comes up as one author.
It comes up mostly as one author. Yeah. The later texts tend to be one author because they're not edited as much. So like the pastorals, they're normally coming up just with the pastorals or just with inside their own book. In terms of Christian stuff, Justin Martyr looks pretty solid. He's writing in the 150s, 160s.
Very prolific.
He wrote a ton. We don't even have all his works, but what we do have, we broke it down into sections. Obviously, when they quote extensively from something, that's
that's obviously going to
it's going to pull it away. But like aside from quotes, he's.
Is there a way to factor that into your? Obviously, I'm sure you can do.
Yeah, we have to remove quotes.
Right.
Okay. Got it. That's a smart move.
Right. And that's something that we really need to consider when running this type of software is think of it like a microscope. So you put a slide under a microscope and it may be blurry the first time. So you've got to adjust your lens. So this isn't some magic software that the very first run you do, it's going to tell you everything that you need to know. So what we did first is we built a test corpus of 100 Greek texts from around that time with multiple texts from the same author. So for example,
that we knew.
Right. So we know Origen wrote this. We know Justin Martyr wrote like at least 3 that we have, or things like that. And so we ran that to make sure that our methodology and the formula we use, because we can use multiple formulas in this software.
Of course.
We wanted to make sure that it worked for Greek of that period. We didn't want to just throw it in there. And if you don't do it right, you get bad results. Just like a microscope, if you turn it the wrong way, it's going to get even more blurry. So
the way that you can definitely know if something is coming back wrong is if you run multiple runs with or you run the test over and over again with different things added in or taken away, slightly differently. You change it up.
You can almost purposefully, you can even test it by purposefully adding in shit.
Yeah. Yes. Well, you put it in or you take something out, and if things move all around, that's it not getting a very good read on it.
Yes. So like, for example, Philemon's really small, right? It's one of the smallest. The 2nd John and 3rd John are small too. We combined 2nd and 3rd John just because they're so small. We need a bigger sample size. Philemon, though, is one of those that it jumps around a little bit because it's so small. But we're able to focus in a little bit and get a pretty solid read on which authorship group it comes in. But there are texts that are just too small. And if they're floating around a lot, then it doesn't mean like the whole thing's messed up. We only get like 96 to 98% accuracy usually on a run that we're confident in.
And you guys aren't the only people doing something like this. Mark Bilby, Dr. Mark Bilby, who we've been interacting with, he is attempting doing something like this as well. And I'm sure other people are trying to go this route.
Right. So you and Mark Bilby are what led us down this path. You had an interview.
Big shout out to MythVision.
Yeah. So
Mark,
So you had an interview with him. I think it was the first one you did with him where he said something like, I wish data scientists would take over this field because honestly, the field of biblical studies is a little bit behind on application of new technology.
And just literary analysis.
Yeah. So, but what we did is we looked into it right after that, and I was like, I wonder if there's something we can use. And so we found this software, and it, like Jaaron said, it's peer reviewed. The software, it's been used for a ton of other studies, and you could even just recode your own program and run the same formulas, and you'll get what we find. So yeah, I think when you do that, the best thing you can come up with really is that it's from the 2nd century. Yeah. The way you'll see it, and you mentioned Bob Price, we actually, if you've got his book, The Amazing Colossal Apostle, he goes through verse by verse of every letter of Paul and says this was from this person or group. We broke it down based off of his, and we can see where he's right and where he's wrong. We've got to run actually if we get there. So yeah. We're able to look at a lot. And like Jaaron said, we run this thing hundreds of times, different ways to make sure that,
and we're still running it.
I still run this. Like I said, I just ran that huge thing. We're looking at Plato. Because you had mentioned, Alexander the Great has stuff in his biography that's just like, they're just taking it out because that probably didn't happen. We think that Plato didn't write all of the stuff that is attributed to Plato. Yeah. Even because there's already, it's like Paul, there's stuff that everybody already accepts is not authentic. And it's the same with Plato, except we find more than what is generally accepted.
Got it. Awesome. Okay.
All right.
Let's keep rolling.
All right. So here's about the program. You can see the formula down there. That's probably the first thing that's going to catch everybody's eye. So we use this formula, Eater's delta, and we also like to use something called Eater's simple. Eater is the creator of this software. So he's from Poland, and several different universities work together to run this and create this.
Eater, by the way, because he's from Poland, his language has a lot of inflection. So it works really well with languages that have a lot of inflection, like Greek.
Right. So, and that's another thing. You may not want to use Eater's delta and Eater's simple on other languages all the time.
Like English or something.
We do, because
you can.
We really like Eater's delta and Eater's simple because it seems to work really well. But there are languages that are less inflected that might not need to adjust the way that this does for Polish and Greek and other heavily inflected languages. Yeah. So, all right. If we are ready, what I'll do is, if you want to close this down, and I'll get the software up and ready.
Yeah, here we go.
Let's do it.
Hold on to your butts.
Yeah. So let's see. Over here.
Again, everybody, I hope you're enjoying this. Go down in the description. You can get a copy of the book. Check out our courses. We also sell here, mvp-courses.com. And let's see what these gentlemen are going to show us here in just a second. I haven't seen this myself. I have chatted with them. We did a little pre-talk, but I haven't actually seen this in action yet that we're about to do together. So hope you're enjoying it. Like the video, comment, let us know what you think so far.
I would like to point out that in our book, in chapter 7, I believe it is, we actually not only share a link, especially if you're on an ebook, which, by the way, is only $3 in America. we price it low because we're not trying to get rich. That's not the point at all, and not capable. But it's a matter of just getting the conversation going. That's all that it is. But we do have in one of our chapters there, not only a link to where someone else could get this software, but we actually go through and explain how you could use it, and how to install it, how to run it, and how to prove us wrong if we are incorrect.
Okay. Yeah. Ready when you guys are. Let's see what we have.
Where is it at? Application window. Here we go. Entire screen. This one.
Entire screen. Yeah.
All right, cool. So let me know when you can see it. All right, right there. So this is our studio. Our studio is basically the way you work with R most of the time. It makes it a lot easier. So we've already prepped it. You call the library Stylo. So you just call it. That's what you do is we can push up normally. And it does, all the stuff you've already done. It's kind of like that, predictive text type of thing. Right. We've set the directory. So this is a Greek test that we're going to do. This is a test just to show you that the stuff works before we actually jump into the New Testament stuff.
Okay.
So then it pulls up.
Drag that over.
Yeah. It pulls up this interface, which looks like this old Windows type of thing, but
got it.
You click other so here's your languages. Greek is not listed specifically. So you do other.
It can also do I believe Japanese.
Yeah, so here is Chinese, Japanese, Korean. So for
Yeah.
characters, we're there. Here is your features and your settings that you're going to change. So we've got, for example, we're going to do words. So n-gram size. N-gram is basically the N is the number of
Words
things
in
you're
a
looking at.
string.
So if I changed n-gram size to 3, it'd look at 3-word phrases. And then every time a 3-word phrase showed up in a text, it'd count that as the frequency.
Yeah,
Got
like
it.
I am Sam.
Yeah,
Like that
yeah,
word.
Yeah.
Got it.
And we do this with the Book of Mormon, and you can find which sources he uses to write the Book of Mormon. It's really fun to do that too. Then we go, statistics. So we're doing a cluster analysis, which makes that tree-like thing. We're going to do eater simple. We don't do any sampling because some of them are already small size.
And go over really fast the features. Go over the most frequent words really fast.
So we do 100 just because it's a default. You can do 500, 1,000. It's really just, again, that's kind of that lensing thing you want to do. You want to make sure you're doing something that's going to be good.
And really quick, just to kind of explain to people. So Stylometry, the way that we're running it right here, what it's doing is it's looking at the most frequent words. And your most frequent words are going to be things like I, you, and, the, but, that kind of stuff. It doesn't get into theme quite yet. If you were to take the 100 most frequent words that you use in a day, your spouse, your kids, your pets, all their names wouldn't be in it. The 100 top most frequent words are not in there. Or the 100... those wouldn't be in a list of the 100 most frequent words that you would use in a day. So these things are usually called filter words. And it's been scientifically proven to be able to identify an author or a speaker just based off of the filter words, because we all use filter words
and function words.
And function words is another way to say it. We use these almost subconsciously. Mm-hmm. So I use them in a unique way from you, Derek,
right.
And you use them differently than Matthew. It's just how it works.
Yeah.
So if you were to write a text, I was to write a text, and Matthew was to write a text, Stylometry, looking at the most frequent words, would be able to tell us that that's 3 distinct authors. And if a mysterious text floats in from out of nowhere, we'd be able to know which one of us 3 wrote it, running it in this software.
Right. We actually run it on our own book, and it accurate in the book. We put
in chapter 7 as well. Yeah, we put
that's a good test. I mean, if you do it knowing where you wrote a paragraph or a sentence or whatever, and you were able to factor that in on your own, you can actually kind of like see and go, okay, this thing's 99.9% on point. Like if it misses a few things, that's to be expected. But
it was, to be honest, it was kind of scary to run it on ourselves.
Yeah.
Like it made me feel weird, because I was like, oh, wait, like at first I was like, oh no, it knows me, like, which is a weird thing for technology. But another feeling was almost like, am I a bad writer? Like, is there anything that's like a tell? Like, does that mean like I suck at writing and Matthew's better? Like, what's going on? Like, what's, so I don't know.
Okay.
Right? It's a weird kind of thing, but it was very scarily accurate.
Right.
Got it. And then, of course, the step after that isn't just the common, it gets into the style, and then you're really catching who the author is at that point, I imagine.
Right. Well, I mean,
the thing to kind of keep in mind is that because the most frequent words don't get into things outside of filter words, it's not being changed by genre or theme. So in other words, if Matthew here was to write a book that was, let's say a fantasy novel or something like that, and then decided to write a letter to a friend, he would still use his filter words in the same way. The theme words, like he wouldn't use the word wizard or wand or something like that in his letter. Probably not, maybe. Depends on who he writes to. But what my point is that those terms are what we generally gravitate towards. Right. And we say, oh, hey, this is fantasy because it's talking about, knights and swords and wizards and stuff. And over here, this is more like maybe something about nonfiction because it's talking about actual people who lived. But
Mhm.
most frequent words wouldn't even pick up
Right.
on those things.
And even if we did say we put 1,000 in here or something, or you could even put like 1,000,000. It might take forever, but what it'll do is it's based off of the frequency on the list that it shows up. So like the word I is going to show up a lot more in like a letter from Paul than the word, I don't know, something else like temple or whatever.
Right.
And same in our language. So like even when you start to get into those stylistic words, they're further down the list, so they're weighted less heavily
Mhm.
than the more frequent ones. So we're just going to run it at 100.
Yeah, let's test it.
Yeah. So what it does when we click OK, so we're going to have it export a PDF because the files can get big, and it should come up on this little corner screen. But I'm going to pull the PDF over when we get it. Okay, we're going to click OK. So it's running, and then it's analyzing it right now.
It'll take a moment usually.
Yes.
Yeah, no worries.
Go ahead.
Yeah, it makes me think the filler words are almost like accent or tone. Like it's almost like when you walk in there and you have an uncle who's like, "Hey, y'all, look here." You know, there's a certain tone in the language that it sounds like your uncle or it sounds like this person. It's just an analogy to give people who are maybe watching.
Another thing that some people bring up is they say, you know, this is something that was written over time. So could it simply be possible that the documents come up as a different, or the text come up as a different author because it's being written over a long period of time? So we tested that. We took a look at known authors over a period of up to 40 or 50 years. And we saw that still with that 96% accuracy, it's still actually showing up. Paul in specific is only said to have been writing over about a 15-year period though. So shouldn't even be impacted by that.
Got it.
So normally my computer runs a little faster on this, but it's got to redo. It's counting all the words right now.
It's still going, right? Yeah.
It should be still going.
Yeah. It can take a while sometimes.
Yeah.
And so what we've got in this test when it shows up is we've got known authors. So like Origen, Josephus, things like that. And then we also have what we consider more or less reliable New Testament chapters that probably weren't somebody else than what we think it is. So for example, like the Timothy letters, here it goes. So you can see how many, there it is. All right. So you can see that. I'm going to pull up the PDF just so we can see it a little better in Zoom.
Bring it over so they know it's
so authentic. Yeah, what it does is in your test file. So we ran the file called Greek test. Here's the corpus with all the text that we ran in it.
Okay.
And then here's the PDF we're going to open. So it pulled it up right here.
It's
so
fine.
We'll just do this. If you're okay with
just drag it over.
So here we go. So you can see, we'll zoom out a little bit. Lucian, we put 3 texts from Lucian in. Appian, Josephus, we have a lot of Josephus works. Diodorus Siculus, Origen, Justin Martyr, Eusebius, Clement, Philo. And the colors are only based off of what you put on this first little thing before the underscore. So it's kind of help you identify it. It doesn't mean really anything. Yeah. And down here, you see it gathers 1 Timothy, 3 chapters in 1 Timothy. It's able to accurately group with 1 Timothy. Ignatius, who is writing in the 100s at least.
And then Matthew.
Which is 3. It's basically the Sermon on the Mount there, because that's a pretty coherent unit within Matthew. Even if it has like another source or something. If you had picked like, I don't know, the beginning of Matthew and the end of Matthew, like if there's somebody who's editing, they're probably going to edit the beginning or end of text. So something that we just want to demonstrate here. This is able to accurately look at New Testament size text, chapter size text.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
if you pull back up our studio there at the bottom. Yeah. So you can also see.
It's over here.
Yeah. It also puts out a little image over there.
Got it.
That you just did. Yeah.
Right. So now if we want, we can get into our Luke test. So actually, before we do that, we're going to go change our session.
And just before we leave this, again, what are we looking at? What is this exactly saying here on the right? Technically, what is this?
So each one of these branches, it's just a different amount of distance. Down here is the formula's distance that it created for different texts. So it doesn't know.
Use that.
What?
Yeah, that way you're looking at the.
Oh, okay. So it doesn't know over here that like this is by a certain person other than the distance between the styles. So like Josephus wrote a lot, right? But his style is consistent to group together. And like Diodorus Siculus is over here. And so like it's not saying that like the same person wrote these, but you can kind of get an idea of how different the style is from Josephus and Diodorus, and then First Timothy and Matthew, Lucian. It's just different styles. Each person's style is so different.
You didn't factor that in to say, hey, these are different. You're saying it found out they were different by the style and how it looked.
Yes,
correct.
So we didn't do anything. We literally just,
or at least closeness to it. Like if you were to factor in a bunch more that was similar-ish, just imagine it might get a little more complicated, but it still would probably factor these together, maybe.
Yeah,
right.
So put them together.
So the fact that the differences in the distances are relative to the text that you put in it. So like if they're really close, like if you put all of Paul's letter in it, even if like they're all by different people or fake or something, they're still stylistically closer than like Josephus and Lucian.
Got it. That makes sense. Especially if someone is writing a forgery, do you not think they're going to try to imitate style? Right. So yeah.
And trying to imitate style, though, I will say this. You would have to try pretty hard to be able to pull something over something like this that looks at those most frequent words, because say for instance, even when people go on to like ChatGPT or some kind of AI program and say, oh, hey, write something in the style of, I don't know, Stephen King or something. Yeah. It's going to use a lot of words that we associate with Stephen King. But again, those words are generally going to be those thematic words, which it's not really taking a look at when it's looking at the most frequent words. Got it. Okay. That's how like Stylometry is actually able to go in and determine if like a student wrote something or if they used AI to write it. Right. There's actually been a lot of really cool modern applications of Stylometry.
Right.
And so let's see, Luke. This is gonna. I really want to see what you guys do here, because this is going to be interesting within Luke to see what happens.
Let's take a look. So what we're going to do is we're going to change our directory. This is our working directory, and we're going to go up a file. And we got all these Book of Mormon stuff too. Yeah,
our Book of Mormon and the Quran is our next project, along with the Old Testament. But for right now, we're Christ before Jesus goes over the New Testament.
Right.
I look forward to the Book of Mormon and the Quran. I want to see what happens there too. Yeah. So
it's
fun.
It's fun.
So this pops up. We're going to do other for Greek. We're going to keep the features the same. Either simple. We're keeping everything the same as this one because we want to, just to demonstrate that like what we did here. And this is just changing the plot size. So when we export the PDF, you can export PNGs, but that makes a really big file. The PDF files are really small if you do this on your own. So I recommend that. We used to do PNGs, but then it would be like 50 megabyte image files and it took forever to create it.
Got it.
Yeah.
All right. So it is now running and boom.
Okay. Oh, you did Luke and Acts.
So I did Luke and Acts at the same time. And we also put in Melito of Sardis, just as a third author to show that like the style, and it's not saying he wrote it. So you can see this big branch off here is saying, it's
saying it's a different person.
Is pull this over here. I'm going to pull up the PDF.
This is just the PDF.
It's the PDF of this image right here. It's just easier to zoom in on that.
Got it.
Okay. Demo. We'll just do that the same.
All right.
Here it is. Okay. So Luke, the core of Luke, right? So what we were saying is that we can test if Tertullian's claim or the Marcionites' claim was true. We can say if the first 4 chapters of Luke match the rest of Luke and not with Acts, or first 3 chapters, is about 3.5. In the last chapter, then Tertullian was right and Luke or somebody like that wrote it. Or the Marcionites are right and the first 3 or 4 chapters in the last chapter would come up somewhere different. And that would mean that the person who wrote Acts wrote Luke. And that's why everybody says, oh, Luke and Acts are by the same person.
Right.
Parts of them, yes.
Yeah, but some of it.
Yes.
Yeah. The compiler, if you will.
Yes, the compiler is
the same author.
Right. And we just have Melito in here just to show like we're not running this by themselves because, maybe internally the author wrote different in style in Acts than he did in Luke. What we're showing is that like this
still comes up regardless of how many people you put in.
So here's Luke, and look how big this difference is, right?
Right.
And then here's Melito of Sardis, his text. And it's
why did Acts 6 get lumped into that?
Acts 6 is a really small text. So Acts 6 is like the smallest or one of the smallest chapters of Acts. And so it's always acting weird.
Yeah.
Okay, got it. That makes sense. I'm glad to ask. So
yeah. So we scroll up and see here what Luke 1, Luke 2, Luke 3, Luke 24.
Yeah, so those are from definitively the same author as, I mean, in order to branch back over, you would have to go all the way to this. Like this establishes distance.
Right.
So you would have to go all the way back to a completely, the furthest possible way.
It's even further
from
than
the
Melito,
author.
is your point. Like it's so different stylistically that it's further than Melito, is your point.
Yes.
Yeah,
Okay.
Melito is closer to the author of Acts and 1, 2, 3, Luke, first 3 chapters of Luke and 24 than
Okay.
Marcion.
And the fact that
Evangelins.
the fact that, again, your point, chapters 1, 2, and 3, and then the last chapter, which would be the places you're correct, that most people would adjust, tweak, change when they're, rewriting or even.
We find this out not only in this one, but as Matthew mentioned earlier, real quick, he touched on Revelation as well. We find that that's what they generally did, is they would, if you take a prior source and you're going to add to it, you would find the easiest place to add to would be the beginning and the end. Putting something in the middle, you have to work really well at trying to fit it into the narrative. But if you put it at the beginning and the end, it works out. And therefore, you have Luke 1, 2, and 3, which kind of establishes Jesus when he's younger. And it has in Luke chapter 2, it has the birth story. So in that particular case, what you have is the author of the Gospel of Luke said, hey, I'm going to take Evangeline. I'm going to rip out that part that has Jesus coming down as a fully grown man in favor of a birth story. And that's what they put there. And that's what we have in the Gospel of Luke. And so we're able to tell that author is not the same as the rest of the, like I said, Evangeline. And of course, Evangeline is, the reconstructions of Evangeline line up with these chapters down here.
Okay. 1 second.
So you can see, you can see, it's really clear the results here. So what we're going to do is we're going to Paul test really fast, and then we're going to look at a few like internal things that help pin down this dating. But like we were
while you're doing that, just to point out, go ahead and pull up Paul.
Okay,
but
cool.
For the audience, and Jaaron and me can actually like discuss this while you're looking for this, is that it looks like whoever wrote the section at the bottom here with Luke, and then at the top with Acts, and then a few passages of Luke, this might reopen the debate with Marcion priority over against, or at least Marcion's Luke, not necessarily Marcion priority. That's a different question on whether or not Marcion's gospel came before Mark. That's a whole nother debate that you guys might be evaluating as well. But
and that's something that we have particular opinions on.
And even if just really quick thinking about it, like even if Mark came before Marcion, they always say, oh, the gospels are at least just 10 years apart at most.
Right.
Like, is Mark really going to be in 70, and then the first version of Luke, Marcion's gospel, in like 130s, 140s? Like why would there be such a big gap?
Yeah,
right.
Mark came out in 70, and then the next gospel is, Marcion's Evangeline in 144. It just seems a bit odd. But nevertheless, So Irenaeus is the one who says that Luke in specific was written prior to Marcion's Evangeline, and then Marcion took things out of it in order to create Evangeline.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
But that is not what we see.
It's the opposite.
What we see here is that there are two very distinct authors in the Gospel of Luke. So that means that there had to have been a giant source that this author used. And in this particular case, like I said, the bulk of Luke, which is down there on the bottom portion there on the screen, it lines up with Evangeline. That is the text that is in Evangeline. Now, yes, it is slightly edited, but at the same time, the reconstructions of Evangeline done by multiple scholars line up with those chapters. So it wouldn't include information that is in the chapters at the top.
So we're on the same page. Getting back to the microscope analysis, here's the microscope, but kind of up here. Once you get into Luke, and then you were to bring in a reconstruction of Marcion's Evangelion, and you can actually zoom in even further and then zoom in even further. And then I imagine once you get into like just dealing with Luke versus Marcion's Evangelion and what's happening, there's going to be some crazy things starting to pop out, I imagine. Okay.
Right. Yeah. And this is the very surface level of this software. We try to keep it where everybody can run it at home. Like we said in one of our chapters, we tell people how to do this. We try to run it with just like almost the default settings, you know, but like we said, we try to adjust for the fact that Greek is heavily inflected.
Right.
But this software is actually able to do something called a rolling delta, which what it does is you put 2 test samples, and that one is a supervised model. We're not using supervised here, but you could put in 2 things, and then it'll make this graph of this person wrote this one on this side, and then this is here.
Yeah, it really zooms in.
Right. We're able to get good results. At about like the 350-ish word level. We actually have a test where we did it on accident in English. We got 350 words or less accurate between me, Jaaron, and a friend in a chat group. I just copied and texted our chat group texts, and
so even using a small amount of data, we were still able to get a good run. So it's really powerful software.
Yeah.
Let's see what this Gnostic Paul's up to.
All right. So what I'm looking at here is I'm using Price's cut up of the text. So, because in the chapter results, when we run it chapter by chapter, it reflects this generally. There are some places where I think he might have got it wrong, but this is because these samples are bigger. So like if people are worried about single chapter things, there's not many of that in here.
Yeah.
Test size is bigger.
Okay. So. And just for those who don't know, a little background knowledge about the amazing colossal apostle, Price has been influenced by a school of Dutch radicals in this particular view who are questioning whether or not these letters are really even Paul, all the way 1800s. I mean, very early on, these guys were already questioning it. So looks like we have results already.
Yes.
Okay.
So once you get it going, it'll be pretty fast. So I'm going to zoom out of it. This is just Paul's text. So we have tests where we run it with the whole New Testament. So this one's just easy to digest because when you get every chapter of the New Testament in a test, it gets really hard to figure out. You're looking at 270 something, 80 something chapters.
Are these just the 13 letters or 14 letters or
13? This is 13.
13.
Okay. Here.
I just figured I'd throw it in there.
Yeah. Yeah. We're going to start down here because this is the easiest. People agree that, the
I don't think people will be able to make out what that is. So you may have to zoom in. Yeah.
How's
there
that?
you go. Yep. That's better.
Okay.
Paul
Right
Philemon,
here.
Paul Titus. Yep.
Yes. So right here, this is the pastoral layer. Everybody almost agrees that the pastorals are way after Paul. Whether you think he wrote 7 or 4 or none, everybody agrees that 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, and Titus are not authentic. Philemon generally comes up in here. And if you've read Chrissy Hansen's book, which I think you had her on recently, she makes a case that Philemon is also inauthentic, which
citing us.
Also, and the book cites us. Yes.
The book cites us.
That's awesome. Hey, good for you. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and then there's also some chapters in Romans here. So Paul Price calls it like a Gnostic selection, and also Romans 4, and then what we call the stolen sermon, which is about half of chapter 1 of Romans all the way to the end of chapter 2. So these were very clearly, they're so far away from the rest of Romans, which is way up here, that down here, these chapters in Romans, and then this portion, the selection.
It is a long ass book. I mean,
it is. That's when you run it at the chapter level, Romans 15 and 16 almost always come up like is something way later. So they're adding on all the time.
I mean, that's not even really a book. It's a letter. It is.
Yeah.
Well, it's supposed to be a letter.
Yeah, you know what I mean.
Size of like a novel.
Right.
That's what I'm saying.
And he's writing it to Rome, like before he heads out to Rome.
Yeah, like who's
like,
gonna?
Hey, I'm writing this textbook. Good luck. Okay. He might have even beat it there.
Right.
So this is something that I think is a big contribution to this study. We're not the only ones to have done this recently. If you look up Authorship of the Pauline Epistles Revisited by Jacques Savoy, it's this peer-reviewed paper from, I think, 2019.
Yes.
He says that he can't come up with the model that explains Paul because the 7 letters aren't authentic. And then the closest is he says 5 letters because 1 Thessalonians and to an extension, 2 Thessalonians come up with the core 4 letters is what we call them. But that's what that Dutch radical school had was 4 letters, more or less. It's 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, Galatians, and Romans. Some of them later rejected all of them. But when that Jacques Savoy ran the test, he found that the Thessalonians book kind of connected to 2 Corinthians, and we're able to do it because we separate it out. And even if you do this on a chapter by chapter level, parts of 2 Corinthians come from the Thessalonian author and only match that, but they don't match the rest of those. Like another part of 2 Corinthians is up here. And if you know from Bart Ehrman or others, 2 Corinthians is like 5 different letters at least.
Yeah, they're patching stuff.
Right.
Yeah.
So they patched, I mean, look how far apart that is. They patched letters from 2 different people at least.
Wow.
So, and it's hard to know that. I mean, if you take the text as a whole, then you're probably not going to see that because it's one text, and then it's going to connect to 1 Thessalonians and 2 Thessalonians. And then we get to this branch right here, and there's 2 groups. So these 2 are considered inauthentic. Colossians is generally considered inauthentic, and Ephesians. So Price separated Ephesians prologue 1 through 3, and Ephesians 4 through 6, which is a different part. It looks like they're at least the same group. Now, sometimes when you don't have enough samples, we say authorship community or authorship group. We don't want to say one person did this, one person did this. It was a community working on these texts. They'd go back and forth, they'd edit, things like that. And then Philippians is up here. And Philippians is generally, it's also considered to be multiple letters, but it's considered to be authentic. And we found that Philippians, it probably also was not authentic. What looks like if there were an authentic Paul, it would be one of these 2 groups, or this could be maybe the same person, but we find frequently that Galatians 1 and 2 are always different than the author of the end of Galatians, particularly 4, 5, and 6.
So the takeaway here is that if Paul is an actual author, if Paul is a person, you could place him there because we seem to have the biggest collection of, I guess, authentic works right there.
Mm-hmm.
You have Romans, 2 Corinthians, Galatians, 1 Corinthians there. These four epistles, bits and pieces of them, seem to come up with, if you want to call him Paul, sure. But when ran with the remainder of what we're running, like the other texts that we run from the 1st, 2nd, 3rd century CE, we see that these still come up with 2nd century texts.
Right.
Okay. So it could be the same author, just later.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. If he existed, he could be who's writing these things, a person who is writing these particular portions of the text, but in the 2nd century. So if Paul existed, he's just someone who's floating out there.
So this, I just want to make sure that everyone's tracking as well here, because I want to give a little pushback and then get your guys' thoughts on this. Okay. And then this is a good thought experiment. A lot of people, I get into trouble with my friends like Kip Davis, Hebrew Bible scholars, pushing the dating of the Bible that we have. What do? I go to solid, concrete data and then work backwards. Like we can know for a fact that they had a form of some of this literature that we have written by the Dead Sea Scrolls, right? We have solid evidence and data to point out. I don't know if that's anti-quem or terminus anti-quo. Either way, it's that we know by this period this has been written. Working backwards is where it gets tricky, because now I'm sitting here going, okay, did this story of the Exodus, did this story about Moses, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, did that story exist or float in some type of material? And then they usually pull out the get out of jail free card, in my opinion, and not saying it's wrong, not saying I can't falsify it. It's the oral tradition card. And then you're like, okay, hold on. So now when I start triangulating this using archaeology and epigraphic and any type of clues to try and find out, were there anyone who made a monotheistic-ish claim for Yahweh and not other gods, like the Bible describes, thou shalt not have any other gods, and that claims that at times in history that Israel itself as a whole doesn't practice it, right? Archaeology is absent of any of this. It's all polytheistic. There is nothing in the names, epigraphy, archaeology that suggests they know the laws or keeping kosher. Names of the characters. I mean, at best, you have stuff that might go back to the 2nd millennium BCE with Abram. But that's a well-known name in Mesopotamia. What does that mean? Like that he really goes back here, or there's a continuation of a name being used in a region? And notice where he comes from, Mesopotamia in the story. So like how do you anchor that? Well, I get in trouble and they just go, well, the model we have, and they already have other reasons. Again, documentary hypothesis. I'm sure you guys are doing some stuff with that at some point. I get in trouble. So now I'm wondering if when you're saying these 4 are 2nd century or any of this stuff is 2nd century, someone might go, well, it's been touched. It's been tampered with. It's like the historical Jesus. If there is a guy, great, guys, you screwed it up for everyone else after you, because now when we try to sift through the legend and myth, how can we find him? How do we know it's him? How can we know what's him and what's the flowerful, fluffy, fictional story of the guy? You screwed it up for us. So I'm wondering if these letters that reflect 2nd century ideas to you, and I'd like to see some of that evidence that you say points to 2nd century, could it be that it points to that because you have redaction, you have scribal add-ins or things like that, or any, I don't know. I mean, you're using this computer that should be able to tell if multiple authors are adding things or potentially, unless it's a one-word thing and then it's too small to even notice maybe. But you see what I'm saying? I'm wondering if there was something of a tradition and what we have has been so tampered with that, you know, it kind of damns them either way. So whether or not it was really written at this time in the 2nd century or earlier, what we have screws us. We're all screwed now, trying to figure out how do we get behind that black box, if you will. I don't know.
It would need to be massive. So this right here, we are using, like we said, Bob Price's sections. When we chop it into chapters, we see it's just more cluttered than this right here because it's actual chapter by chapter, but we see the same divisions. So what my point is that each individual chapter would need to be edited up to, or at least 70% in order to come up where we're seeing it consistently. Because a text, it's roughly about 30% edits before it starts thinking that there's another author. So in other words, if you wrote a book that was 4 pages long, you wrote 3 pages, I wrote 1 page.
Yeah.
If we ran it all together, it would still show up as you because only 25% came from me.
Got it.
So a file can be up to about 30% edited before it starts flipping out. And
so
that's
good
when
point.
We start seeing things bounce all around, like I was talking about earlier. So if it's at least 70% of one particular author, then it's going to stay consistent. And so that's
there's stuff slipping through the cracks no matter what. You guys are like, you know, no matter what, we can't get everything.
So there might be some little tiny line, but overall, what I'm trying to say here is that if these are coming up with 2nd century authors, which they do whenever we run the entire corpus that we run, that would mean that each and every chapter of Pauline epistles was, as you said, corrupted, so to speak, by someone later on over a minimum of 70%, each and every chapter section that we look at.
And then that's to the point to like, what do we know about that person? Because we have Acts, and as we showed, Acts is late, and then people already question the accuracy of Paul's description in Acts. So then we get to just a few chapters in Paul's letters that really, he doesn't tell us much about himself. And then if we're talking like 30+% edited in each chapter, then like how much do we have? And that's what we find with this Galatians 1 and 2 is the best part of Paul's biography. It actually frequently comes up as a later portion of Paul's letters. And that's what Price and, like you said, the Dutch radicals say, that the first 2 chapters of Galatians look like they're added on later, kind of to defend Paul. Because if you read Galatians 3, it sounds like the letter's restarting. It goes into like, oh, you foolish Galatians. He's calm, and then all of a sudden he's like changing his mood. And so
he's just schizophrenic.
I mean, but that's probably because they're piecing stuff together. And so that, and like you said, you were talking about like, when do we start to see the text of like the Old Testament? We don't see that until a lot later than you would expect if these texts were way older. Same with Paul. So like with Paul, we get First Clement, which it mentions Paul pretty extensively, but they have a different tradition about Paul in there. They have him going to prison a different number of times. When we run First Clement, it's a composite letter, just like 2 Corinthians.
It's showing up with other texts from the 140s, 150s, and 160s.
Right. And the first person that even mentions that letter, again, is Irenaeus around 180. And then we get the letters of Ignatius that mention Paul. And again, it's a different tradition about Paul. It doesn't mention him too much. but that shows up. Actually, it tends to show up right here with these letters, which is called the prison letters.
And Ignatius does.
Right. And then that goes back to, and we're not 100% on this part of the theory, but if Lucian's Peregrinus is Ignatius, like some people have made the case for, I've got a book over here that makes the case that being so,
Peregrinus is,
that if he was, because they say Lucian explicitly says that Peregrinus wrote scriptures of his own, or wrote texts of his own, including letters to cities, just like Ignatius does, and he edited texts of others. And we know that these two texts are edited, and they show up close to Ignatius, but not close enough to be
I need to clarify here real quick, because this sounds like a conspiracy here. You're saying that are there academics who suggest that Peregrinus, you're saying, is actually Irenaeus? That you're saying
Ignatius.
Okay.
Yeah, there's two.
The claim is that Lucian is actually jabbing at Ignatius when he's jabbing at Peregrinus. That Peregrinus is Ignatius.
That's a theory. We're not attaching to that fully.
I mean, I've never heard of that. I'm just curious because
So
he talks about him being a lawgiver, like the early sophist lawgiver that was crucified and all that kind of stuff. I was just curious to know who's saying. Is there someone out there that's written on
there's this book. Hang on, I actually brought it in case this came up.
Sorry, I don't want to get too caught up on what's it called?
Right. It's called A New Look at the Letters of Ignatius of Antioch. Yeah, I'll hold it up right here. By Roger Parvis, who was a former Catholic priest and educator.
Interesting.
Yeah. But his case is basically, he actually reconstructs the letters, but basically, Ignatius is from Antioch. And he gets arrested, and then guess who else gets arrested in Antioch is Peregrinus, and they both are said to have written letters to cities. They both seem to have this weird death wish. If you read the letters and then Lucian's description of Peregrinus, and they're editing, and that's going to happen. Peregrinus' story happens in the 140s, 150s or so, when Marcion has just published stuff, and then all of a sudden we get edited Pauline letters, different versions of Paul's letters.
That's an interesting.
The icing on the cake is that Peregrinus, his death, is setting himself on fire at the Olympic ceremony, the opening ceremony of the Olympic Games in 165. Ignatius literally means the fiery one. So, I mean... Okay.
I got to look into this. This is a fun one because my whole adventure lately has been looking at early church Gnostics, but really just Christians, and how syncretic they were, syncretizing, if you will, for those who don't know, amalgamating the various deities and traditions from Greco-Roman, Dionysus, Osiris, Attis, you name it, like the Naasines and other early Christians. And if you read that story by Lucian with Peregrinus, if your hypothesis that you're suspecting could potentially be the case, not even saying it is, it just is interesting because he forsakes Christianity in the end. He's exiled by Christians for probably manipulating these gullible, as he calls them, gullible
fools,
fools, and
miserable wretches,
And then in the end, he acts like Heracles, and of course, there's the language is so beautiful. I love reading that. But anyway, sorry for the rabbit trail. Never heard it. You got me excited when you said it.
But
that's your fault.
Does say very explicitly. And see, this is why we have Q&As for our book, Christ Before Jesus, there on TikTok just about every day, or at least every other day, and people will come up and they'll bring up points and they'll say, oh well, I feel like Jesus existed here. I feel like you guys are wrong for this, that kind of thing, and they'll bring up different people, and every once in a while someone will say Lucian of Samosata. They'll bring him up. And I said, you do realize that the book that you're referring to, the story you're referring to from Lucian, literally says that this Peregrinus wrote books for the Christians in the 2nd century.
It's not good.
He's literally saying that these are texts that they're getting written and edited, both of them, in the 2nd century. And he even mentions that he writes letters to different cities. And it's like...
Yeah, so of course we can't pin the tail on the donkey knowing exactly those sources, but it's like, if any Christian has like this super overly confident point of view, it's like, dude, lower the confidence and like realize
not as good as you think
it's not helping you. Okay, so getting to Paul, You guys have brought up some interesting things. Again, just so I properly stillman you, Jaaron. It's Jaaron, correct?
Yes.
Jaaron, I want to pronounce it properly. Is that if there is this later thing like you've been doing with Hebrew Bible, and we can see that it's got 2nd century material, you're suggesting that the computer, it would really be obvious if they really added 70%. I mean, like it's this massive chunk you would need to see indicating that that's what's happening, and we don't see that. You're saying it seems like there's a pretty univocal in this one text, in the one book.
And so we use, we tend to use, I don't know if we do in this one, 1 Corinthians, we do right here as our like anchor text, because honestly, parsing Price's work on 1 Corinthians was really hard. And the reason we use his is because he's one of the only one that actually tries to break the text apart instead of saying, oh, okay, Galatians is authentic, so we're not even going to look at, potential divisions in there. Or so yeah, it would have to be this huge portion of it. And what we're seeing is that at most, this like core Paul, if it were an authentic Paul, it would only be like 3.5 letters, because this would have been part of 2 Corinthians.
Okay.
And so, or it is part of 2 Corinthians, and it's in that Thessalonian layer is what we call it. So once you run it all together, and then you look at when are these texts first cited outside of the New Testament itself, or by non-Christian, or even just by Christians, because Paul is never mentioned in any historical record. We don't have anything like even a Josephus passage about Paul. Yeah. The first one would be 1 Clement, which is, it's a composite text like 2 Corinthians. And on top of that, it doesn't have the same history about Paul. And then the same thing with Ignatius, and it looks to be later. And even so, Ignatius is writing in the, earliest in the 100s, but we're saying 140s, 150s, even if he's not Peregrinus.
They're still getting the story put together.
They're still putting it together, because Acts isn't out yet. The full Pauline corpus isn't out yet. And then who is the first to publish a collection of the letters of Paul? And it's Marcion.
In 144.
Okay, so sorry to interrupt you. Can we move this off the screen now and be able to focus? Because this is the conversation. This is where the fun stuff happens. All right, continue.
Yeah. So Marcion is the first that we know of to publish a collection of Paul's letters. And he has Galatians first, and he publishes it with a gospel. So the gospel is the one we just looked at in in that Luke portion that's not from Acts. So that was his gospel. Right. And then comes Galatians, and then Galatians is his bio, more or less, in Galatians 1 and 2. And then he has the other, I think he's got 10 total letters, maybe or maybe not, Philemon. And so that's the first time we get it. We don't have a corpus of Paul's letters before that. That's the first collection. And even in that first collection are these inauthentic letters like Ephesians and Colossians. And so once we look at that, even in the 140s, those are considered authentic. You could say that they were written before, like in the 90s, like some say. I think Bart Ehrman puts those in this like 90s or so. But what we're saying is that, no, this is probably a Marcionite church that is publishing its first canon. And these letters are epistolary fiction. So there's a good book, and we can show that slide at the very end of the list of authors that we suggest. And there's a book in there by Patricia Rosenmeyer where it's called Ancient Epistolary Fiction.
Yes.
That was a genre. And if you've ever seen, I don't know if you've seen like Pride and Prejudice or even Harry Potter. Those books, they have letters inside them because that's part of the story. And when you look at the whole canon that Marcion published, Paul's letters are part of the overall story for his foundation of what Christianity was. He has Jesus descending from the sky, and then Paul never meets Jesus, even by his own confession, and he's given a revelation from, more or less the sky from Jesus. And that's part of it. That's what it is. And we don't have, anything before that that's really solidly dated.
Based on your guys' conversations, I'm sure you've reached out to some people like Marcus Vincent and other people who've been diving into this kind of stuff. Do you happen to know, or is there any working hypothesis about Marcion's antecedent for crafting Jesus like this? For example, I can turn to, let's say I could find John's gospel seems to have, as it seems to be a tragedy, it has imitative models with Euripides. There's so much in common. Dennis MacDonald wrote his book, The Dionysian Gospel. And I'm like, yo, dude, water and a wine. Like, do I need to go into more? And of course, apologists demand the jot and tittle have to be exact copies in order for them to be persuaded, which is absurd. No crafted piece of literature ever Xerox copied things like that. They're imitating, they're competing. This is part of mimesis and Hellenism. So I guess what I'm saying is while you have models like Dionysus, or you might have models like Socrates or Heracles in Jesus, do you find any mythic antecedent any mythic comparison that they may have modeled this descending full-grown human being from heaven? Is there anything?
So, I mean, there are a lot of mystery cults that it's drawn from. Christianity, I think, always was a syncretic religion, and it always pulled in people. Even in Acts, you see them pulling in groups that are similar to them, but they're not the same, so they're pulling them in. So it was just a mystery cult. The Marcionite theology was that there are at least two gods. So there was the demiurge, which was Yahweh, and he was not a very nice god. He was just uncaring, but generally portrayed pretty negatively.
And then God the Father.
And then there's God the Father. And so
above that God.
Yes. And so God the Father is the father of Jesus. And so he sends Jesus down. And so that's probably what the Transfiguration was about. Actually, I think I forgot who in their commentary, they say that the Marcionite understanding of the Transfiguration was that Jesus was meeting with representatives of Yahweh, and he, as a representative of God the Father, was ransoming the souls.
That's why there's a constant clash of I have said, and God is speaking through him against the Torah, Mosaic Torah, with Yahweh being,
Yes, because he is purchasing or ransoming the souls. And you see that language of ransoming in Paul a lot, especially in Romans, of ransoming the souls away from Yahweh towards God the Father. And that's what brings salvation. And then the Jesus story is, it was around beforehand. The mystery cult of Christianity was around beforehand. This is the culmination of its combination of other religions up to that time, including Judaism. That's why, he gets all these details wrong about like the geography and stuff, because he's not from there. He's from Asia Minor.
Yeah. It's just a syncretic document, so to speak.
Right. And then
writing mythology.
And he was the first. And that's why, Marcion was such a controversial figure.
So I think it's interesting to see things in different ways, like how you're describing it, because when things get so close, like you have these competing sects, it's easy to conflate them and act like, well, really, they're almost the same exact sect. And technically, one's just usurping or coming up with a newer model within that community. And there are other scholars like M. David Litwa. Really, we could list several, I'm sure. And even James Tabor seems to be going down this path lately. In our recent course that we discussed, we have a course we just did that's on the 7 letters. He starts that he does assume they're authentic, but even in them, there's elements of them where he's like, this doesn't sound like Paul within Judaism. This sounds like a guy who's bucking against and an elbow to Judaism. So he's not in line. Though he calls himself this Pharisee, right? Yeah. He is this radical other. And it's a really interesting kind of observation that you just painted. So I need to ask you guys one more thing before we go, because you've made some claims. What is some of the most obvious evidence in your research for both of you that makes you think Paul's letters are 2nd century? The ones that look, we can go to Ephesians, we can go to these ones that already are disputed, and I imagine most people won't bat an eye and go, okay, yeah, whatever, maybe it is 2nd century. But like the 7 sacred, canonical, legendary, written in gold on stone, don't touch authentic Pauline letters. That's what I'm talking about.
Right. Well, I do want to point out that like when we get further into the pastorals, they actually mention Marcion's text Antitheses in 1 Timothy. They mention probably Polycarp and his scribe Crescens.
Yeah,
so like
1 Timothy was 6:20,
and then 2 Timothy 4, like around 10, somewhere around there. Yeah.
Okay.
And then going into getting to the Thessalonian letters. So 1 Thessalonians is considered authentic. 2 Thessalonians is not. 2 Thessalonians, though, we find them that the authors were probably very similar in the same community, if not the same person. But that line in it's in 1 Thessalonians where he's like, the Jews have got the wrath of God that they deserve.
Yes. A lot of people interpret that as 70. Others think it's Caligula or being kicked out of Rome by Claudius. Or
we think that's Bar Kokhba in the 130s. Okay. And then so 2 Thessalonians, if you read, which I know is fake, but we're possibly same author, but same community for sure. That portion in there about the man of lawlessness is talking about either Bar Kokhba or Hadrian, because Bar Kokhba persecuted Christians for not joining in the effort there. Yeah. But then getting into the actual, like, I guess the 7 letters, excluding, what was it? 1 Thessalonians. So we just see a lot of elements of, like, they call it proto-Gnosticism. Like Paul is attacking this proto-Gnostic thing. Well, no, it's just Gnosticism. He's attacking another side. This letter is like a compromised piece of work. So I think when they talk about like Apollos, for example, you see Apollos appear in 1 Corinthians a lot in particular. I think that might have been maybe Apelles, because we see in one of the earliest versions of Acts where Apollos, he shows up in Acts 18 and 19. They actually have Apelles in there in, I think, Sinaiticus, either Vaticanus or Sinaiticus, one of the earliest versions of Acts.
Has the other name.
Using,
Oh, instead of Apollos, it's
Apelles.
Yeah.
Yes. And so I think we're seeing this, brushing over that. We see other anachronisms in Paul. I think what Paul is a 2nd century interpretation of how do we do Judaism or our religion post not only destruction of the temple, but post Bar Kokhba, where basically Judea has been wiped out. It's a Hellenized version that's kind of coming to terms with that. I think Romans 9 through 11 has some like post-temple language. You could interpret it that way. It's very different from the rest of the text in Romans. We see these pieces together.
Mm-hmm.
And then finally, for me, my favorite piece is probably Romans 1 and 2. We told you that was like a stolen sermon from somebody else.
Right.
If you read that, that is integral in the text. That does not look like that was like just haphazardly thrown in there. That was intentionally in the text, and probably, in my opinion, in the original form. The original form of that text was a piece together work. And so then you got Romans, which is like one of the core ones. It's got that. We've got that chapter 4 is by a totally different author than the rest, possibly 9 and 11. Romans becomes such a piecemeal piece of work, and so do all the others, that it makes more sense to say this is the work of a group collective, a school of thought. And when do we first see Paul's letters come out? When we have no evidence aside from First Clement and maybe Ignatius that we actually have remnants of, because we only have fragments of Papias and like Eusebius. So and he doesn't mention Paul anyways. Justin Martyr in the 150s never mentions the name Paul, but he's working from the Church of Rome. Paul supposedly was a huge influence there. He never says the name Paul once in the 150s and 160s. Why? Because Paul was associated with the heretics. That's what Tertullian called him, the apostle to the heretics, because Marcion introduced him. So,
sorry, please go ahead.
For me, so my take on Paul in specific on being in the 2nd century. So first of all, just to kind of let you know, I mean, obviously there are other scholars who have presented this to, and even coming from another perspective, non-data science driven perspective, we have Dr. Nina Livesey, who works out of the University of Oklahoma, who is coming out with a book here at the end of the year. I believe it's December is when it's this month. That is over Paul, and how Paul is just more or less a pseudonym for the Marcionite students that are working to construct these letters of instruction as just text in specific that you would read to understand more about how to run a church or how to understand Christianity. Similar to how Seneca did in the 1st century.
In the moral letters.
In the moral letters, about 124, 127 of them.
Yeah, a bunch of them. And just to clarify on her position, and it'll be clear in the book, I think she thinks that there was probably a real Paul, but he didn't write the letters, probably, is my understanding, based off of reading the summary and stuff like that. So because we see this happen over and over again with like Plato and Aristotle and all these other people, this stuff gets attributed to people after the fact, that it came from their school, or maybe it didn't come from their school and somebody just wants their letter to get credibility, or somebody didn't know who it came from. It's this anonymous text. And so they said, well, this looks like the work of Plato, or it looks like the work of Paul.
Right.
Like
so technically you can't rule it out. Like, and this is the important point, is not to be dogmatic for viewers but I like this, because this makes us add more pieces to the puzzle to consider. Aristotle, I used a quote from him, but as I did, I realized as I researched into that, trying to find more about Dionysus wine miracles in my recent documentary, and the scholars were like, it's very questionable whether or not he wrote this, but his school definitely did.
Yeah.
And so it's like, oh, okay. So you have to jot in like, okay, they're writing, saying the Aristotle. So, I have my hunch and thinking there might've been a guy named Paul. I don't know why they would, unless you can show me, like, I need more background knowledge. I'd need more understanding. Kind of like when we talked to Carrier, right? Dr. Carrier, I'm like, hey, I would be more budging toward actually entertaining this making more sense than there was a dude who charismatically was mythologized in some way.
Right.
If I saw more celestial Jesus material, and that would start to make me budge, right? More. If I saw more of that, it would help me. The sad part is, even if he was correct, because there's so much material that's already here, again, if it is fabricated and it has a dude walking on Earth, I'm in a screwed up pickle because I'm trying to go with the data, as much data. And if the data has been scrubbed and whitewashed or cleansed or like tampered with, and it was originally celestial, that's unfortunate that we can't get to knowing what happened. But I like the idea that you guys are bringing up about Marcion, looking at Paul in that way. Romans 9 through 11 has always been this weird kind of thing to me. Israel's brought in, and that's not used elsewhere in the letter. And then the fullness of the Gentiles I see is echoed in Luke. Again, here we are in Luke's gospel, which is the disputed Marcionite kind of territory. And it talks about the temple, or it sounds like there's the trampling of the Gentiles that are coming in, like a war's happening here. Okay. And it's like the fullness of the Gentiles, but then in Paul's, it doesn't seem to indicate the war aspect, but it has this kind of Gentiles and the fullness of them. And I thought it's echoing Genesis 48 in some way, and it might be alluding to it in some way, but I don't know what to do with some of this stuff, right? I'm just sitting here scratching my head, entertaining hypotheses, and talking to you guys.
I think something that kind of stood out to me is what you have the second century authors or church fathers talking about. So when they were discussing back and forth over like things like circumcision and whether or not that was an important thing to keep doing. Well, if Paul was writing in the first century about this, then it should have already been established. You know,
right. Why is it still being disputed?
Why is it still being disputed? It's the same way that, just to kind of hint at our future work here, at the Book of Mormon, we're able to tell when Joseph probably wrote the section on baptism of the dead, because we're able to tell from some of his other writings when he and his friends were arguing whether or not that's a thing that they should include.
Interesting.
And whether or not that's a good thing. And so we're able to kind of say, okay, these people absolutely had a hand in this text, because if he had read some, golden plate that said, hey, baptism of the dead is A-okay, why are you arguing this?
Well, that's the Dutch radical thought process and also Bob Price mentions that in The Amazing Colossal Apostle, is like, hold on, this sounds like the school of Paul is disputing these things here later, is his point. Why is it still being disputed? One could try to pull out the card and go, well, the Trinity and Arianism and various forms of this stuff was still being disputed for centuries. But yeah, and I mean, I guess that could be a pushback to try and argue back against this. But
you'd have to establish that those things were even
I think
early concepts to begin with in the first place, I guess.
I think the Trinity probably comes from trying to justify, like, how do you have God the Father?
The Marcion issue,
the polytheism in early Christianity.
Because, I mean, if he's saying that he's the son of a different God, and now you're trying to say, oh, well, we need this other God out of there, and we need him to be... You're trying to smooth over God the Father and the son of this God and everything like that. Like, how do we explain this in the most possibly Jewish way?
But speaking of baptism of the dead, that's actually, I think, in Romans or First Corinthians, and that's a Marcionite practice. That's a second century.
It's also a mystery cult practice. There's other mystery cults.
Right. So I think, why would they create the name Paul? I mean, I don't know. I think people probably created Zeus, for example, but then some people might say, well, Zeus may have had some historical core or something, because he came to Earth and maybe he was an ancient king. I've heard that case before.
Yeah, euhemerism. Yeah.
Right. But so it goes, it's which way you want to go on that. I mean, that's up to debate. And like you said, there's a lot of evidence to weigh, and everything's so corrupted and copied over this. And so
at a certain point, you almost got to realize that, if the data that we're looking at is corrupted, then if we're wrong based off of corrupted data, then I guess the entire Bible's wrong. We're all back to square one.
This is Okay. So either way, your confidence, right? Like, should not be if you're going to take it on faith, take it on faith. That purposely is absence of evidence. I know that Christians hate when we say faith is the substance of things hoped for, evidence of things not seen. Look, it's okay to have hope and have hope and want to have faith. That's fine. It's like when when you enter into the sphere of I'm going to do scholarship, I'm going to do accurate information, I'm entering into the historical domain, and I am peddling this, acting as if it's this thing that you rigorous critical thinkers are going to be doing, and you're doing the apologetic thing, I hate to break it to you, you're going to get guys like me who are going to just come and go, nope. And then you're going to go, you just hate God. No, dude, you're just bringing absurd, not good arguments and not great evidence into a sphere that you should have just kept your stuff over here in the faith bubble and not tried to attempt to make the science. It's like flat earth or young earth creationism, and then forcing that into the sphere of we really should be considering this and be taught in schools and stuff. If anything should be taught in schools, it's how that's not the correct view that we've once had, and to show scientifically how that's the case. Now, of course, any claim, they shouldn't just hand wave it. It should be critiqued. It should be shown to be falsified. But at the same time, I think you get my battle is here. I was the guy peddling the confidence and this can be trusted. And when my wife would say 12 years ago, as someone who never studied the Bible at all, she's like, virgins don't give birth, Derek. And, and I was like, you just don't understand. This is the word of God. Like I had this happened. And, there was no amount of evidence at that time, I don't think, that could have got me. It was like a slow, gradual growing out of it kind of and learning new things. So, gentlemen, Christ before Jesus, we've done some serious stylometric kind of approaches to how your software or these ideas that the software you're using can help us maybe distinguish authorship, maybe at least make more questions. I feel like this work you're doing is a fun one. It's one that is going to make more people have more questions than answers. It might bring answers, but more questions than anything. And that's the fun part about it, in my opinion.
Yeah.
And just to kind of tie it in, and hey, maybe this is for something in the future. I don't know, but to anybody who's watching and thinking, hey, well, how does this end up with Jesus not existing? In short, without getting too in the weeds here, this just helps us take a better look, a clearer look at the timeline of Christianity and how things evolve over time, how these gospels later show up in the 2nd century that have a genealogy and a birth story. We just showed how the Gospel of Luke in specific is literally taking an idea, a text before it that had just Jesus coming down out of heaven and said, hey, no, let's put a birth story. Let's make this guy more human. Adding human elements to it. So most people, when they take a naturalistic view of Jesus, or I would even say most say atheist.
Bart Ehrman, right?
Yeah, Bart Ehrman. When he looks at the New Testament, he sees a historical person who was deified over time, and I get it. But what we see is a deity that gets historicized over time.
Got it. That's what Richard Carrier.
More or less what we come down to, and we can get into that, some other time. But that's what we get, and that's what we see from this more clearer timeline using stylometry.
So many interesting ideas, and I love entertaining them. I try to obviously not get caught up in the how do I put it? There's a growing social movement amongst scholars that try to resist even entertaining these, almost dismiss it out of hand because you think there may not have been a guy, and it doesn't help. I think when you have popular figures like my friend Bart Ehrman, when he's so staunchly against the idea, but I get it. He equally brings a scalpel to fundamentalism, but it's that's why I did my last documentary. And I'm like, hold on, there's guys in your schools, you're training for ministry, that you're bringing critical scholarship to, that you're not laughing at. They think virgins give birth, or that, people walk on water, or dead people come out of graves and things like that. But the guy who thinks there may not have been a dude, that he was probably fictional, that guy gets mocked and laughed out of the room. And Michael Jones did a response video, Inspiring Philosophy, Christian Apologist, mocking, very condescending toward me. And my intelligence, of course, is kind of thrown back and forth, because I go through a little bit of my testimony getting through the zeitgeisty kind of versions of mythicism into the Bob Pricey and the Richard Carrier types, and then started to get to more like what is a consensus at and where I'm at, and that I'm sympathetic. Even today, I'm sympathetic to forms of mythicism, though I'm not a mythicist at the moment. I'm very open to that actually being the case. And when I say I'm not a mythicist, I'm not saying like, oh, I'm so on the historicist side that like, I think there may have been a dude, just like there may have been an Apollonius Satana. There may have been other historical guys that got mythologized. But I really want to like change that current of social dynamic that takes place and allow people to be able to question these things without the mockery, because I don't think it's equal. I don't think that's absolute fundamentalism, literal resurrection from the dead, all that stuff we should believe. That's absurd. And therefore, so is mythicism. Maybe forms of mythicism that are like being factually incorrect with source material, inaccuracies, purposefully conflating or comparing, over comparing when there's no evidence to support it. Yeah, I get it. Dismiss that. But like, why are we so certain about this dude? You know, why are we overly stating the case? I don't know.
And I think it's a fair question for really any historical figure before we start really documenting stuff. You know, people bring up George Washington, like, oh, well, how do you know George Washington existed if you're going to question Jesus?
Yeah,
like, we literally have like, we get that all the time. And then, you know, they go back to like Alexander the Great, and that's a bit more of a fair question. It's further back. We have less like, you know, but we've still got a decent amount of, you know, physical evidence. Physical evidence is primary.
Cities.
Right. Yeah.
That he conquered.
Right.
In a row.
Yeah. So that kind of physical evidence comes first. And then we like to put like data like this. This is another form of analysis. That's going to come after that. But there's not a lot of great evidence for Jesus, much less early Christianity in the first century. Really what you've got is Paul's letters. But if Paul's letters are second century, what is there to connect the 30s when Jesus might have been crucified to anything? I mean, you know.
This is an interesting thought experiment, right? And I'll hear apologists want to argue with me about how historically reliable, and like, Derek, you're not checking out how there are accurate historical things in the Gospels. You're only looking for criticisms and poking holes. I am doing kind of a scientific method. But what do you get in John's Gospel? Just take John, for example, which is actually giving us more data than some of the other Gospels to try and anchor this stuff by saying, oh, there's the Siloam pool or the Sheepgate pool, or like, okay, we found that there are actually these things, these pools that were in in Jerusalem near the temple, and they want to use that and somehow then anchor, or that there was a Pontius Pilate. That somehow means, you know, and like as if fiction wasn't incorporating realisms and verisimilitude to real, actual, historical, real world things. So it's weird tug of war that I'm always constantly going through, trying to be fair, trying to be honest. And when I see that, I'm like, okay, yeah. If I were to write a fiction, a tragedy, look at Euripides. Just one example. Dionysus. It all takes center space in Thebes, a real city with real cults that were like the standard beliefs of the day. And what is the whole purpose of this, according to the scholars who are seeing the Euripidean tragedy overlaid on John's Gospel? Here's this new guy on the block, a new divinity with a new cult, giving us the kind of Marcionite-ish type proto kind of what's going on here with John's Gospel. And he's bucking against the standard Jerusalem temple cult. And they're not happy about it. And he's saying, no, I don't give a shit. You're going to be Theomachoi. You're going to be Godfighters. Go for it. Just like Euripides. And they get accused over and over. So it's a fiction to me. And once you do that, if there is anything historical, like, what are you going to... Anyway, we're back to circles again. You see what I'm doing here. But you guys are awesome, man. I hope that more people will consider talking to you about this stuff that are obviously not in a... They're clearly, the faith bubble is probably not going to be as open to these things, but I would hope that this might inspire some of the academics to consider using some of this stuff and maybe see how that can help them dive deeper into the research.
Yeah. Right. And that's why we put in there how you can do it yourself. And we've had people that come to us and say, hey, can you just do a private one-on-one conversation? Help walk me through installing this, or walk me through like doing, you know, whatever. We're happy to talk one-on-one, because a lot of people want to talk in private, because like, is even scholars, like even if they might be sympathetic to the possibility of some of these things, may not want to publicly talk about some of their views. So like
Yeah,
we
yeah,
don't
yeah.
we don't tell who we've talked to normally unless they're okay with it. We're happy to do one-on-ones for
That's
anybody
good.
who wants. So
Well, I encourage anyone who's watching, including the academics who watch my show, there's quite a few of them out there that will peep and check out where things are with MythVision and what we're up to. And if they think this would be useful, they can already see this. I've got some mathematician type scholars who are also New Testament might find this useful. Check it out. Reach out. The links will be in the description. If not, you know how to email me, and I'll be happy to get you connected to these two gentlemen. I hope people will go get a copy of your book and look forward to more. You're on TikTok as well, if I'm not mistaken.
Primarily. Yeah, we have a website too. But TikTok, you can find mostly Jaaron, sometimes me, go live and we'll answer questions and we'll be on there for a while, whether they've read the book or not.
Yeah.
So.
Usually we have about daily or every other day we have 3-hour like lives there on TikTok where we just answer questions and go over things and debate with people and all kinds of stuff. And there's scholars who pop in, and there's people who have barely even read the Gospels who will pop in and talk. So you never know what you're going to get. But yeah, we are there on Amazon and audiobook and everything that was read by us, which if you don't like our voice now, don't get the audiobook.
Hey, check it out. Go into the description. Check these gentlemen out. I hope more people will pay attention to you. Thank you so much, guys. Thanks to Joshua Bowen for initially making it clear that I should talk to these gentlemen. It's been a blast. And until next time, never forget, we are MythVision.